Welcome to Explorations. Today we'll be talking with Christopher Stapleton, who is an experienced architect and producer and CEO of Semiosis Real World Labs and co-founder of the Virtual World Society. In this fourth of a five-part interview, Christopher discusses how our brains work analogically and how integral it is to understand that story is the fabric of our reality. He shares how he has been extending reality across a number of dimensions and how this has helped him to help populations at risk of isolation. I know that in the last few years, you've been leaving this world and traveling into a virtual one, and that it's opened up many doors for you and many possibilities. And you talk a lot about extended reality. Talk about this notion of reality and these sort of gradations of experience all the way into virtual reality and back, and how you see them as seamless.
Right. One of the amazing things that working with people with aphasia taught me is that, and working with all forms of media, is that this aspect of story that's beyond words, that's beyond media, that transcends all things that we are, and that is that which is central to us. And just recently in research of the brain, we realized the brain works on story, and the fact that everything we remember is attached to a story. And once it's attached to a story, which has to work with both reason and empathy together. It's not like a computer where it's all analytical. It's what we call analogical. Is that where that's what sticks? That's what makes a difference. That's what helps us change. The analogical reasoning is what helps us with empathy and reason. And so with this aspect of story way beyond storytelling or story listening or story acting or story this or that we hear a lot about, is that what is that story beyond it? And one of the things I realized with this history of story, with the history of media, is that story is the fabric of our reality. There is no reality outside us. We get stimulus from every sense, from every aspect, in that we form a mental model in our head. And that mental model that's fed with the sensory input is able to then pack away into memories, but also reconstruct in visions of the future. And then at night, while we think that we're not doing anything, our subconscious pulls all that model to pull it together and spew it out to us as if our subconscious is the master storyteller, putting us through this sequence of events that looks a lot like a movie or experiential game or something, but isn't. What's happened to me? How is that happening? And so reality is in the magic is behind the eyeballs. It's not out there. But for us to survive as a society and advance as a society, we have to have a consensus of what that reality is on the outside. And so it is this aspect of story, which we translate it into language, which we translate in conversation, or what I call this sociality, that really reaffirms our mental model with other people's mental model, so we can have this consensus and work together, so we can manipulate the world, so that we can be fed and clothed and housed and earn money and all that other stuff. And then what we see recently also in the world is that how impacts propaganda and stories and conspiracy theories and gossip and everything throughout history has had an amazing, both good and bad effect through ancient times. And so this is what pulls together in our brain, weaves together all these pieces of information into this fabric, this story fabric of reality. And so from that, I realized that as a story designer, as an experienced architect, I can be able to work with all those threads of that fabric and create a certain reality with the physical reality, with your internal imaginality, and then extend that reality so that externally we can not only bring in virtuality into the physical world with augmented reality, augmented virtuality, but we also can then as it goes into our mental model, we're creating this whole imaginality that is not it is separated in a scientific, technical aspect. But for us as human beings, we desire to be one world so much. And that one world doesn't mean anything unless we connect with others in what I call the third axis of extending reality, and that's the sociality. And that's where we get, all these other, emotions and human connection and social engagement. And so one of the things that we discovered with aphasia is that we weren't doing anything for aphasia outside of helping them build their natural abilities. What we were really doing is helping them out of this isolation that the loss of language gave them. In that if we can work with helping them come into normal day world and help prevent isolation, how many other different populations that are at high risk of isolation, whether it has to do with the prejudice or with your with disabilities or deployment or disenfranchisement or any of these things, we can help these populations at risk of isolation to help them come back into society. Because really what causes isolation is us not being physically isolated. It's our natural society being so efficient at isolating others, is that we are the ones disabled. We depend too much on the efficiency of language, and we depend too much in separating this broader river of communication that we can engage others with, and that we really lack that empathy and reason working together to really kind of get inside each other's heads, to really come together as a social engagement. And so with that on Earth, we were approached by the space industry with our work formerly with NASA and education to say, hey, do you realize that isolation is the only one psychological obstacle that is preventing human habitation of Mars and deep space? Is that if we don't solve it on Earth, how can we solve it on Mars? And if you're going on a mission to Mars and it takes months to get there, years to do it, and months to come back, they are in a population at a high risk of isolation. And how do we prevent that from causing depression and affecting their immunity system and affecting their human team performance, and then possibly leading to more devastating things? How can we keep them out of it? How can we transcend time and space for them to connect with their family and professionals at home? How can we take this aspect of this therapy and pack it into a story world, this extended reality, and have them take it along with them on a mission to really kind of help sustain a healthy, minimally daily requirement of human connection and social engagement with their family and colleagues back on Earth. And that started our research with Space Florida and our partnership with the Israeli Innovation Authority on looking at isolation. And what we really realized is that once it becomes isolation, it's probably gone too far. What we need to do is prevent us from going to isolation. Our real focus is how do we enhance social engagement or social cohesion? And that's something that we can measure by measuring social cognitive behavior. And so now we're going into transferring the story trove, this conversational story creation technique, into what they call social XR, which is a social environment that we mix these realities into, that they can visit, much like a holodeck or anything that Star Trek would get into. But mostly it's painting with the imagination and connecting, overcoming the limitations of technology in order to make that connection with another person.
So let's just park there for a second, because I'm just trying to imagine I'm an astronaut. Maybe there's one other astronaut with me. Maybe I'm alone. I don't know.
You better not be alone.
Yeah, I hope I'm not alone. You have that wonderful, what is it? Matt Damon was in that film where he gets left behind on Mars and has to survive. So we have a problem technologically because of the delay of communication. I don't know, it takes 15, 20 minutes for anything to get to Mars, right? So you can't have a conversation. You can say, hey, how are you doing? And I'm going to come back 20 minutes later. So how does that start to look in terms of how do we create an experience for the space traveler, or for any of us? If you think about the pandemic today and how that is also exacerbated, I think, our feelings of isolation. How do you begin to work with these extended reality concepts to give me a sense of sociality and a sense of connectivity?
Great question, and it's not about isolation,
Yeah.
because you can have solitude, and I've gained a great deal during this last 2020 year of quarantine. People were much more accessible through telepresence and Zoom and things like that, and so that was very advantageous for me. What research has happened of people in quarantine is that they start to see their brain activity looking a lot like you're starving for nutrition, is that you're starving for human connection and social engagement. So that really comes to realize, oh my goodness, there's such a thing as that we need a minimally daily requirement of social engagement and human connection. What does that look like? Well, what we were working with Story Trove and Aphasia was that daily meal of connection, which we wanted to kind of explore and understand. And so what happens when you're going to Mars, and if you can remember Matt Damon, what he did to survive, he didn't just stoically say, I'm alone, I'll just do what I need to do and not connect. He had to connect one way or another. And this is usually what you see with people with aphasia, determined to make that connection, to make that leap to those who they can't communicate to. And then through asynchronous communication, find a way. But in his mind, they were both occupying the same story world, whether it was in the same time and space. And that's where we have to transcend it. So we use things like game mechanics, where you have turn-based kind of mechanics to really kind of, and then story, this cause and this call and response techniques that goes back to ancient times, where how we can kind of reconstruct the story, which doesn't necessarily also have to be linear. It can be non-linear, compartmentalized, and then become more of a conversation that's a turn-based conversation. And that there are, it's like a chess game. A chess game is like a conversation, but it's not in real time. It's turn-based. But there's this thing that he's evolving through that story. But when he was going through, and he was the #1 botanist on Mars, that was a story he was telling himself. But it wouldn't mean anything to himself if it didn't, he couldn't communicate it to the rest of the world, because that was a thing back on Earth. It's not a thing on Mars. Mars didn't care about him. Mars, like nature doesn't care about us really here on Earth. And that story, that fabric that he concocted, and even his science and botany is a story. Even numbers are stories, data is stories, and how he figured out how to make that communication happen. And so one of the things I learned from people with aphasia is that their determination, their perseverance, their agility when they have it, and usually those are the ones I work with, because most of the people do not go for therapy when they have aphasia, but that's what gets them over that. And that's what I wanted to connect up with. So with you're out there, I want to find out how I can have you connect with your family, with your colleagues, not only on Earth, but in space. Because, if that other partner that you are with on Mars starts to look at you cross-eyed, or starts to make certain smirks that you read into his expression, you're going to realize, does he not like me? What is he thinking? Does he think I'm inadequate? Is it what I look like? Is it what I said? I mean, you are going to create stories in your head about what the other person is thinking that is going to totally unravel any of your sociality, and you're not going to realize it till it's too late. And one of the things that we want to do is really explore this heightened level of sociality with conversational story creation, and understand what makes up those components, so that when we start to see it happen between people, whether they're in the same space or time, is that we can pick up these different cues. Like, are we boring each other? Are we, like me rambling on, or are we kind of engaging them, or are they offended by what I said or corrected them? Or, these are little things, these micro exchanges that have to be captured. and measured and then brought back to us in a way that has what we call the intelligence of crowds, if you will, of all the subject matter expertise on earth, if we can aggregate it into understanding and reading it, because we are really bad at reading other people's, intent. We are really bad at even self-efficacy of our sociality. We really need a way to use technology and have this conversation with technology and artificial intelligence and machine learning, so that this human machine communication can really help tag us when we're off base, or something that might deviate into a predictive kind of situation that might worsen our social engagement. And so this is really kind of coming into a really wonderful, one of the most heightened level of conversational story creation. And that is what I call social story analogics, is that our sociality is a story in the making, is a conversation. And we don't want to measure it for analytics like Facebook or Google does. We want to have human reason in analogics, which means that levels on intuition and experience, but that of a larger group, to really kind of sense and feel things, not just to measure them, to really kind of help us. And that's going to be our augmented story intelligence, if I can make up a term for you.
Yes, you can. So, what strikes me as I hear this is that what you will learn from doing this with people traveling into space will help us back here on Earth. And I can imagine bringing people together. We often, this is a thorny issue with political divide and people who are so polarized in the way they see each other. But to come together around a table to co-create a story. It's not about politics, but it's about something else, but it's about connection. And the
Yeah.
potential for that as a way of rebuilding the fabric of our connectivity as we've become a little more atomized in a sense, and separated. How do we begin to build those connections across the divides?
Right.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, and this has
Oh
been
dear, I was just about to answer that comment.
well. Then we'll go for it. Go for it.
Well, this conversation of innovation is really important, and innovation has had a increasingally rapid cycle, but it stopped at 20 years. And so we saw this pattern of radical innovation happening every 20 years, but we couldn't get that cycle smaller. And so, like the invention of the mouse happened in the 60s, but it wasn't innovated till the 80s when Steve Jobs applied it to certain things. And a lot of these things, that cycle couldn't grow. And that's only because researchers depend upon the next generation, their protégés, to really kind of take their invention and take it one step farther. And that we can't wait 20 years for people to die off and people to grow up. And so what I've discovered is this transdisciplinary collaboration that is able to do what different generations could do, is getting different disciplines working together to spark the imagination, to question the status quo, to kind of think outside of our blinders, or what I call innovation blindness, where everyone has to be their own expert. And I get a lot of resistance on the campus and research and suggesting to foundation researchers that maybe everything that they say isn't really the best way, and maybe there's another way. And so this transdisciplinary collaboration was able to kind of help one discipline work into another discipline's problem space. And this is what really sparked and would more rapidly tighten that innovation cycle, because it made us think differently. And what that took was a special talent of becoming a novice. Because if I was an artist going into a computer scientist or surgeon's room, which I did in Munich, an emergency room, I was going into their world. I was a novice. And even though I was a highly educated, articulate, experienced novice, it was very different. And they had to tolerate me being a novice, but I made them think differently so that they could jump over their blinders, innovation blindness, to see a jump that they couldn't have seen by themselves. And so it was my interpretive story of what they were doing compared to their interpretive story, that they started to have this conversation between surgeon, computer scientist, and artist that really made it these jumps. And so that I started to become what I call an expert novice. And that's what we need to innovation, and to really kind of get that conversation between disciplines, between our ruts that we work ourselves into, to really kind of skip our rails that we're doing, to really get into exciting conversations. Very few people I find can do that. They're so secure in their expertise in isolation. It's hard for them to work outside of their different reward system, their different gratification, their different kind of ownership of their knowledge. And that just breaks down conversation.
You know, it reminds me of the Buddhist concept of simple mind. And there's a great story in which a scholar comes to see a Roshi, and the Roshi is serving tea, and he's pouring the tea, and he keeps pouring it, and it's beginning to overflow the cup. And finally, the scholar says, what are you doing? You're making a mess here. And he says, and the Roshi turns to him, he says, your cup is so full, there is no room for any wisdom. And I think of that notion of simple mind. I had a teacher, Paula Underwood, who was Native American, and they talk a lot about the wisdom of young eyes, because we often think and associate wisdom with people with lots of experience. And her dad one day was walking with her, and they came up to a semi trailer, and he was 6 feet tall, and here she was 3.5 feet tall. And he says, well, what's on the other side, darling? And she could describe in great detail, but of course he couldn't see it because he was blocked by the trailer. And so we have to become, in a sense, innocent again.
Yeah.
To be able to see things that others who have been enmeshed in a particular idea or a particular way of seeing it just can't see, because it's become habitual.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. I love that.
And when
Well,
you talk about the commonality, we have more in common than we have our differences. And that is really important to reconnect with. But we also realize that common sense is not common practice. And so that's where we need to kind of step outside of ourselves, or outside of our routine, in our structure as well as what we think and assume story is, to realize that there is universes beyond what we know, and that's that teacup. And so on that note, I want to thank you for allowing my teacup to overflow on your interview. And I hope that I didn't make a mess of it.
oh no, I love all the tea flowing all over the place. It's been terrific having this conversation with you, Christopher, and we'll do more of this. This is probably, I think, the first installment. So I'm looking forward
Okay.
to continuing that conversation with you, and I really appreciate you taking an hour out with me this morning on explorations. Thanks so
And
much.
can I invite you to a vlog that I do about conversational story creation and story troves?
Oh,
Because I want
absolutely. Yeah. Tell us about
to teach
how can people connect to that?
yeah, I want to teach people how to create these conversational story creations so the whole world is doing it. And
Beautiful.
you can help me.
Yeah.
Use
You
their
have you have a
storytelling.
Facebook page that's Story Troves, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And
So people can connect with you through that. Absolutely.
as soon as I recover my Facebook account from Facebook, that faceless corporation, I'll
Yeah.
figure something out. But
That's another story. Thanks again.
ciao.